Welcome to StabtheDragon Productions, episode number 192. Today is Saturday, December 28th, 2024. It's 64 degrees here in Fort Worth, Texas, and we're going to start a series of reviews on Canadian whiskeys to prepare me for another project that I'm working on locally, let's say. I've done only 2 Canadian whiskey reviews in the past. Black Velvet and Alberta Premium 80 proof. But I've done lots of Irish reviews and a whole bunch of Scotch reviews. I actually tend to like Canadian whiskeys better than Irish, but I don't know. It's close, but I tend to go with Canadian. And Canadian whiskeys don't get much respect in the whiskey community that I've seen. So, Seagram's VO is what we're going to look at today. Canadian blended whiskey. And again, in the whiskey community, I have not heard or seen anyone mention this whiskey in the 10 or 12 years I've been in the whiskey community. Now, back in the old days when I was a kid, in the 60s and 70s, this whiskey was heavily advertised. It was in newspapers, magazines, billboards. I mean, it was a popular whiskey. And if you chart the success of whiskeys back in the 60s and 70s, this was one of the absolute top whiskeys in America. And yet today, it's pretty much kind of a bottom shelf whiskey, even though it's $20 for a bottle. I've got here some Canada Dry ginger ale, diet, 0 sugar. I'm going to make a little cocktail with this whiskey just to see how that works. I've done the 7 and 7 with the little brother of VO, and that is this one, Seagram 7 Crown. More about that later, but today we're going to focus on VO, but we'll certainly bring up Seagram 7. There's an interesting relationship between the two. Obviously they're related, but in different ways than you would expect. So just the facts. Seagram's VO, Canadian whiskey, a blend, product of Canada, Canada's finest, imported. All that's on the bottle. It seems like they're trying to make a point there. This whiskey comes in at 40 ABV or 80 proof. There is no age statement. This 750 milliliter bottle cost me $19.95 in December of 2024 here in Fort Worth. It is owned by Sazerac. VO is, though, produced at what may be a Diageo-owned distillery in Valleyfield outside of Montreal, Canada. But then it is shipped to Louisville, Kentucky, where it is bottled there. Now, the tasting notes that I got from this whiskey and that are commonly referred to is a little bit of honey, caramel, a little bit, perhaps some grassy notes. I get a little bit of wood even on this. Corn is common. Maybe some light fruits like possibly apple and maybe white grapes. So these are the tasting notes. My score, I gave this a 73, which is pretty low for me. Better than some, but still is fairly low. My letter grade, which emphasizes drinkability, is a B-. My recommendation, I find this whiskey to be very drinkable and enjoyable, but at $20, I could recommend dozens of better whiskeys. And so, there's blended scotches, there's bourbons you could get for that price. I mean, Wild Turkey 101 is, $21, $22. So ultimately, I think that this whiskey is a 1960s era relic That's fine for somebody like me who's a history nerd, unless you want to, put on a pair of bell bottoms and a tie-dye t-shirt and listen to some Creedence Clearwater Revival. Uh, this whiskey's probably not for you, really. It's kind of past its best by date. Now let's get to the details. History. In 1857, in Waterloo, Canada, a German-Canadian, William Hespler, and an American, George Randall, built a steam-powered flour mill and a distillery called Granite Mills. In 1863, Hespler hired young 23-year-old Joseph Seagram to help manage the books at the distillery while Hespler went on a long trip to Europe. Seagram ended up marrying Hespler's niece. Imagine that. In 1869. And then Hespler also decided to sell shares into the company, so Joseph Seagram became part owner, and by 1875 they were shipping whiskey to Great Britain and all the major cities in the northern tier of the United States. Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, New York. By 1883, Seagram was the sole owner of the distillery and business and renamed it Joseph E. Seagram Flour Mill and Distillery, making 1 million gallons of whiskey per year. That's actually quite a bit for back then. Their big seller, a German rye whiskey that had a German name, but he renamed it Seagram's Old Rye. In 1911, Seagram's sons, Edward and Thomas, joined the firm, and in 1917, Seagram's VO was released in honor of Thomas's wedding. The VO was a 10-year-old rye blend and became their biggest seller. Despite their success, the seeds of struggle had been sown by politics. The Ontario Temperance Act of 1916 was kicking in, and in 1920, America followed suit with Prohibition in the Volstead Act. And the whiskey business was now in trouble. Enter Samuel Bronfman and his Distillers Corporation of Montreal. He kind of rescued the business in 1928 because of all the bad things that Prohibition had done to the business, and he soon took over the business. Kind of joined, merged partners, and then takes over. Bronfman was born in Romania, but his family fled the persecution they suffered as Jews living in Tsarist Russia. Sam and his family prospered in the hotel business in Canada, and during the Canadian temperance years, they still profited from the liquor trade, using some legal loopholes in the law and some illegal bootlegging as well. They imported Scotch and did some kind of mail order business with Scotch that was, a technical legal loophole, I guess. But eventually, and then the bootlegging thing across the Great Lakes was, in fact, a thing. And that's a whole nother topic. I could do a video on Prohibition era. But in 1933, Bronfman was set to flood the thirsty American landscape with Seagram's VO because he saw the end of Prohibition coming, and so he had built up a stockpile, aged it, and sure enough, when Prohibition was rejected by the 20th Amendment, 21st Amendment, he sold lots of whiskeys into America, and so Canadian whiskey and Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey flooded the American landscape, and that hurt the American whiskey business because the American whiskey business then had to start from scratch, right? They didn't have anything produced and aging, but the Canadians did. After Prohibition ended, he opened this distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, later to become MGP, where he made a lighter whiskey known as Seagram's 7. There you go, 7 Crown. And in preparation for the 1939 visit to Canada by King George VI, and that's Queen Elizabeth II's father, he and his company created Crown Royal Fine Deluxe. There you go. Specifically for the royal family, and it went on to become a worldwide bestseller. So there you go. Seagram's eventually owned 39 distilleries around the world, and it was just a hugely successful company. He died. Sam Bronfman died in 1971, but his sons carried on the business. But the third generation of Bronfmans began making other businesses their major concern. Whiskey was falling on hard times in the 80s, apparently, as I guess vodka and gin were surging and whiskey in America was declining. So eventually Seagram's Beverages was purchased by Pernod Ricard in 2000 and then sold to Diageo in 2001. Diageo in turn sold VO to Sazerac in 2018. And so today what we've got is Seagram's 7 is an American blended whiskey owned by Diageo, which is a British company, and Seagram's VO, the Canadian whiskey, is owned by Sazerac, an American company. So they're owned, they both have the name Seagram's, but they're owned by different companies from different countries. And look at the similarity of the bottles, labeling, even the plastic caps are the same, the bottles are the same, labels are remarkably similar, and yet two different companies. So they obviously have got some kind of a deal worked out to show their family heritage, how they're still related. I don't know. I find that amazing that they're two separate companies now, but they look alike. Here you go. So today, Seagram's VO is not showing up in the top 20 whiskeys sold in America, but Seagram's 7 is. Canadian Club and Crown Royal are often in the top selling whiskeys in America, the top 20. Crown Royal is at the very top, first or second, usually. Tastes in food, restaurants, and whiskeys change over time and generations. And so this famous brand that used to be in the top of whiskeys sold in America is now not even in the top 20. There you go. So for history, 5 points for history. Cheers. Bottle, label, marketing, website. The bottle is cylindrical, dark brown, plastic screw top. The label's bold and classy, though some may call it gauche, I suppose. The label clearly emphasizes that it's imported from Canada, and it looks kind of old school, really. Classic, almost antique. Some may say it's anachronistic, and maybe the whole thing is. Maybe, Seagram's is. Campy even. Yeah, maybe so. I like it, though. I think it's a good-looking label and bottle. The label says since 1857. Now, the great question is, what does VO stand for? Nobody knows for sure today. I think that died with the Bronfmans. But it's likely either very own, since it was developed for the Seagram family wedding, or very old, since it was originally a 10-year aged rye whiskey. When I was a kid, I remember seeing the advertisements for this in the 60s newspapers, magazines, and billboards. And the website now, if you go to the website, it's one page of the Sazerac website, and it's pretty sparse. So for bottle, label, and marketing, 4 out of 5 points. Composition. I can find no mash bill for this whiskey, but historically, rye has been a leading component of Canadian whiskey, and in the history of this whiskey, at one point, it was a rye mash bill. So Seagram stated that in the past. Corn is also very common in Canadian whiskey, so we can assume this is rye-based, but with a heavy corn component. I used to think that Seagram's had vodka in it, but I don't think it does. All my research now says no. But the way they blend Canadian, they do bring things up to a higher temperature than is allowed for American bourbons. But again, that's going to be for a light whiskey. Their base whiskey is what Canadians use, and then they use another whiskey as the flavoring whiskey at a lower temperature when they distill it. And again, there's no age statement on the bottle, none. And Canadian whiskeys have a 3-year minimum, and people reviewing this whiskey state that it tastes young. So my best guess is that this is no longer the 10-year-old type stuff that Seagram's originally had. It's no longer the extra age stuff that Bronfman's had. I think this is now probably a 3-year whiskey. That's just a guess. So for composition, 9 out of 15 points. Appearance, this is a very pale whiskey, maybe one of the palest I've seen. I tend to like darker whiskeys for just my own personal choice. So this is going to be as light as something like Cutty Sark, maybe. You know, just a very light. So only 2 points for appearance. Nose, very faint. And my nose is next to useless. I'm getting some vague, grassy, sweet notes. Maybe just a hint of nail polish, but not in a strong or bad way. Yeah, just a little hint of sweetness, honey, maybe. Not really picking up any fruit on the nose. So 7 points for nose. It's kind of my generic score because my nose is so bad. Tasting. This is a pleasant taste. Light honey, touch of corn, definitely corn. Some spiciness from the rye, maybe. And so, to me, even though it's probably more rye, I'm tasting more corn. I don't know. But there is a hint of spiciness in there that could be related to the rye. I'm getting just a hint of wood in there, which is a little surprise. Now, some people say there's a bitterness to it. I'm not taking that as bitterness. I'm taking that as wood. No ethanol, which is a surprise. Not bold, not complex. It's not a bourbon. You know, this is a light whiskey, a light blend. And so really it's enjoyable, easy sipper, not much depth going on there, but I'm going to say 19 out of 25 points for taste. Mouthfeel, burn, and finish. Again, for a non-age stated whiskey, this doesn't come across as thin to me. It's certainly not rich, but neither is it thin. It's got a decent mouthfeel with an appropriate light burn, appropriate tingles, very smooth, not harsh. This is not going to be like a bourbon. It's not got that harsh element. It's not like a single malt that's got that harsh line through it. The finish is short as far as flavors go, but there's a lingering tingle that says, I just drank a whiskey. There you go. And that actually lingers longer, you know, than I would have thought. So there's nothing bad on the finish here. You know, if your purpose is to make a drinkable whiskey that has no flaws and doesn't stand out, this is a success. I don't pick up any flaws. It's just weak on character. You know, there's not much depth. But all in all, the mouthfeel, burn, and finish, I'm going to give it 11 out of 15 points. Neat or mixer? Well, I like it neat well enough. It can certainly be used in a cocktail, which I have right here. So I've got my VO with Canada Dry. So we'll see how this is right now. And that absolutely works. That would be very refreshing. I mean, I'm fortunate that today's a sunny day. It's 64 degrees. Usually in these winter months, I don't drink iced drinks very much. And so I haven't had a cocktail in a long while, but this is nice. So, at just under $20, I would say it's fine for cocktails without a question. I've certainly used its American cousin, Seagram 7, in the classic 7 and 7 cocktail, and I like that, and my wife likes that. So, 4 points for neat or mixer. Price, value, and availability. Goody goody, had it here in Fort Worth for $19.95. Specs $18.18. Total wine $21.99. So for value, while I don't regret buying this, $20 I guess is a fair price, but I can get several blended scotches and then some bourbons for this price or less that I would definitely like more. And so when it comes to Canadian whiskey, I much prefer Canadian Club or Crown Royal. Now Crown Royal is going to be more than this. Canadian Club's about the same or a little bit less. So while the price is fair, I don't think the value is quite right. Availability seems good, so only 7 out of 10 points for price, value, and availability. Bonus. Now here's where the history and tradition comes to play. This is a great historical whiskey that had a great place in Canadian and American history once upon a time. It's clearly fallen on hard times in the past 35 years. Yet it's still here, This is still on shelves. It's still around, so I guess it sells. I can see this being a cocktail whiskey, but my purpose in cocktails is not to lose the taste of a whiskey. I want to taste the whiskey as well as the cocktail stuff. So it depends on the type of cocktail, right? So like here with the Canada Dry Ginger Ale, I still taste the whiskey a little bit, just a little bit. So bonus points, yeah, 5 points. So I think it still has, its history and its past. It still has a purpose, so 5 points. My total score, though, is pretty low, 73. Letter grade emphasizes drinkability, B-. My recommendation. For many years, decades even, this whiskey was one of the most favorite, well-respected, top-selling whiskeys in America and Canada. Today, there are a lot of comparably priced whiskeys that are far better. Even though I like this whiskey and respect its history, I simply can't recommend it to anyone unless you're like me and are deliberately sampling your way through history and all the whiskeys. Maybe if you find bourbons too harsh, you can drink this, as it's fairly easy sipping. And I certainly don't regret buying this one. And I do have a purpose for buying this and reviewing it for something I'm working on locally. But I don't foresee buying this again once this bottle is gone. I might keep the Seagram 7 around because I do like the 7 and 7 cocktail. But again, it's not bad. I don't find anything flagrantly wrong with this. I will gladly drink this bottle and enjoy it. And if anybody was to offer me a drink, if I'm in a social setting or somebody's house and they say, hey, I've got some VO, yeah, I'll drink it. Fine. Now, if they offer me a bottle, no, I don't have enough space. Sorry. But again, for 20 bucks, I have a long list of others I would recommend over this. So sadly, it's a relic of the 1960s. And maybe if you wanted to put on some bell bottoms and a tie-dyed t-shirt and play some CCR or watch a 60s era movie, VO would be the perfect whiskey to help set the mood. Conclusion. Well, I feel sort of sad after this review. I love history, and studying the history of whiskey is fun, but this whiskey used to be at the top, and now it's a bottle of memories from a time when I was just a kid and not even drinking whiskey. It's been passed by with the years and advancement of whiskeys. But the good news is that we live in what will be known as the golden age of whiskey. You youngsters out there, When you get to be my age, you will look back on this time and say, that was the golden age of whiskey. I've got 5 distilleries within 20 minutes of my house and a 6th whiskey company that imports their whiskey from Lawrenceburg, Indiana. There you go. Local connection to Seagram's. Whiskey labels and distilleries are like baseball cards were when I was a kid, highly tradable amongst friends. And so you get Seagram 7, owned by Diageo, a British company, and you get Seagram's VO, owned by Sazerac, an American company. Well, that's all for Stab the Dragon Productions today out here.